good idea will evoke an emotional reaction for me when I think about it, and a strong emotional reaction. And that you go, okay, there's probably something there. You don't have to approach it that way. There are times where my partner and I are working on a project and we go, oh, that's an interesting area to explore that hasn't really been done yet. But for me, what I find most interesting is if it gets an emotional reaction out of me.
You're listening to Screenwriters Need to Hear This with Michael Jamin.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Screenwriters Need to Hear This. I'm Michael Jamin. I'm here with Phil Hudson. We got another...
That's me.
That's Phil over there. He's got a different voice. You could tell when he talks because he sounds different.
I do. I'm told. Sound like my brother, though. I don't like that. I don't like talking to my brother.
Oh, interesting. Because you sound like you don't know who's talking.
It just, when I hear my own voice, I'm like, that's my brother Scott, and I don't care for that.
I don't like hearing my own voice. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So today's episode is called "Ideas Are Worthless," which is interesting because so many people think when they're writing their spec, feature, or whatever, they need a great idea. Or they'll say to me on social media, I have a great idea for a pilot or a TV, whatever movie. And my response is always the same. So, you think you have a great idea. If you maybe you do, so write it. But some people just like, oh, I have a great idea. Who do I sell it to? No one. That job does not exist. No one. You can't be an idea person. No one wants to buy your idea. And that's because ideas are absolutely worthless. It's the execution of that idea that might be worth something. But the idea, you don't need a great idea to write something great. You need a good idea. And even if you have a great idea, that doesn't mean you know what to do with it. And you wouldn't even know it's a good idea unless you were a writer. You may think it's a great idea because you have a giant ego, but it doesn't mean you can do anything with, only a writer is going to know if it's a good idea. Because you don't know how many times people pitch me, I have a great idea. I'm like, that's not a great idea. That's a scene. That's a line. That's an attitude. That's not an idea. I've even been into meetings where executives say, pitch me ideas. And I'm like, and I just roll my eyes. I'm like, that's not an idea. You have nothing there. You have nothing there. And, I don't say it out loud, but you're not going to. There have been times where I've gotten notes on something and I'll say, I wouldn't know how to write that. I wouldn't know how to write that scene. And I'm a professional writer. And it's because the person telling me they're not a writer. They wouldn't. So they think it's a great idea, but it's not. Unless, if I don't know how to write it, it's not a great idea for me.
Right.
So again, there's no job out there for idea person. Some people have it. Like, you might be if you're a big shot at a company, if you're Katzenberg, you might be able to be the idea person. And so we'll often go into a meeting where a big shot producer will have an idea and they'll pitch us an idea and we'll say, we'll do it. But it's not the idea that we're latching onto. It's them. It's their coattails. It's the fact that they can sell it and get it made. The idea is almost inconsequential. And I've been in meetings where big shot producers, this was before the pandemic. We met with a real big shot. Like I'm talking a big shot director, hit movies. And he had an idea and I was all set to say yes, because he was going to be attached. But the idea was so terrible. We couldn't figure out a way to say yes because we couldn't, I don't know how to do this. So, but it wasn't, again, it all had to be, in that case, it had to be a mediocre idea. We would have jumped onto it. But the idea of this idea was bad. I was like, I don't know how to do that.
But isn't that selling out, Michael?
Good. Yes. Give me a paycheck. This is my living. I have to make a living. So if I got to make, I can't pretend like I'm some, I'm an artiste. I got to pay the bills. So
that's an important thing, because I do know that my time in film school, where I was 10 years older than the people who were there with me, a lot of that pride of ownership and personal integrity, which I'm not saying you should throw out the window at all. I think you need to have integrity. It's the most valuable thing you have.
Right.
But there's a level of, what you call artiste, or the auteur, that I think is going to get in the way of you making it as a professional. And going back to our last episode where we talk about resistance from Stephen Pressfield, that's a form of resistance, is resting on your scruples instead of executing the work that you've been called to do.
A lot of times people think I'm too good for this. All right, well, I guess you'll stay home and do nothing. if you're too good
Yeah.
for it. I don't have that attitude.
Well, you've received a lot of hate on social media for this, right? It's like, I'm
I
a
don't think
professional
a lot,
writer.
but some. What?
A lot more than most people would, I guess.
Uh-huh.
You're a working writer. You're a professional. This is, when people like give me a bag of money and I will give you my idea, right?
Yeah.
You can now take my script because that's the job.
Yeah. If I sell my script and you want it, it's yours now. Someone commented, I think it was just today, that she made a comment like, I never heard of that show, because I mentioned one of the shows I wrote on. I think it was Opening My Residuals. That's what it was. And I never heard of that show. Oh, and that show sucks. I'm like, all right, well, both of them are better than the shows you're writing on.
As you're holding money, like money that's been sent to you years later.
She may have been right. Maybe the show, maybe it did suck, but you know what? It's better than what you're doing, honey. So, I got to pay the bills. But some of the shows are really good, and some of them are not so good. But whatever, it's my profession. This is how I got to make this. I always do the best I can. But
yeah,
what are you going to do?
So my question for you is, in a situation like that, where you have this big director, big producer, whatever it is, and do you want to reveal who that was, or do you?
No, I'm not going to say who it was for sure.
Cool. But go ahead. Do you have a thought you wanted to say?
Well, I had another thought. Like, so if I said I had a great idea for a movie, like I'll say like Inception was a great idea for a movie. Put it in my hands. I can't write it. Like I could barely watch it and understand what's going on. So I can't write it. So a great idea is not enough. You also have to have the great person who can execute that idea. So, and a lot of times people come up with like crazy ideas. This is a great idea. Okay, but can you write it? No, you can't write it. So what do you want from me? I mean, here's another great idea, or here's a bad idea rather. Here's a bad idea for a movie. How about a movie about a poor boy who wins a lottery ticket, and then, but the winning ticket, he gets a tour of a factory. That sounds terrible. That's Willy Wonka. That's everyone's favorite movie is Willy Wonka. But that's a terrible idea. But it's executed so brilliantly. So the idea is nothing. Here's another terrible idea for a movie. Painfully shy girl can find love for everybody except herself. I mean, that's right out. It's a home. That's right out of the. I don't want to say that, but it's right out of like. it's like textbook. Painfully shy girl can find love for everyone but herself. That's the plot of Amelie, which is one of my favorite movies. It was a work of art, that movie, because it was executed so well. Yeah. One other example, and I've probably said this before, but maybe not everyone listens to every podcast. But here's a bad idea for a movie. Young kid gets out of college, has an affair with an older woman, gets bored with her, and then winds up having sex with her daughter. That's the plot of a porn. But it's also the plot of one of the best movies ever made, The Graduate. And so it's all about the execution. The ideas, the execution's fantastic.
Yeah. All right. So for our longtime listeners, this topic might ring really, really close to something that came out in episode 10, which is ideas versus execution. And I put this on the docket for us to talk about again because it's something you still get asked about. It's something we still get talked about in every Q&A we put out. There's a lot of these questions that come out. It's like, I have this great idea. Will you write it? How do I find a writer for my great idea? It was a very common one you hear, right?
Yeah. Why would a writer want to write your idea? That's another thing. Don't you think writers have their own ideas? So they're going to take your idea. They're going to do all the work. They don't want to work with you. They just don't. They don't want your idea. They have their own ideas. And, you're not bringing enough to the table. So you're not going to sell it. Get out of it. Get that out of your head. Write your own damn idea. You do the work. Yeah. And you'll discover it's not so easy. Well, then if it's not so easy, have a little more respect for what the writer has to do.
Yeah. And stop razzing Michael when he opens checks from his bad show he wrote on.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So for you, I was going to ask, when you work with these like mega directors and producers, like pride of ownership, right? How much pride of ownership do they have versus like ego do they have involved in this process when you're writing something for, like, you talk about Glenn Martin DDS. It was produced by, what's his name? Eisner?
Michael Eisner, yeah.
Eisner, head of Disney for forever, like did amazing things there in terms of the parks and the corporate side of things. But what about working with those types of people, and not him specifically, because I don't want you to like call him out for anything good or bad. Just generally when you're working with people who can be the idea person because they have that clout.
Oh. Well, first of all, television is very collaborative. as a rule. So you don't really get a lot of people with this, like, I'm an auteur. That's really not what TV is. You're working with actors, other writers, directors, other creative people. So you're working together. And so compromises have to be made because you're working with people. And that's why I don't feel what we do is art. When you're making art, you shouldn't be compromising. You should be doing what you want to do, and this is your expression. But when you're making commerce, you have to sell it, and compromises have to be made, and they should be made. And so that's why I don't feel like when I write TV, I'm more of a craftsman. When I'm writing my own stuff, my collection of personal essays, that's the closest I've ever come to art, because it's like, it's what I want to say, and no one else is telling me what to say. But working for people like that, even with the case of Michael Eisner, who came up with this idea, he gave us a lot of latitude. There's only a couple times where he really wanted to do something, and I would try to talk him out of it. And he'd kind of give you this, yeah, you're going to do it my way. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And we had a couple of those. He wrote the check. Right. We did it his way, and that's fine. It was fair. That's fair. I spend the money.
That's awesome. All right. So coming back and making this like actionable for our listeners, how do you know whether an idea is worth writing? Like what is the mechanism for that? And I know you go into detail in your course on this, but for those who are not in the course, what's some valuable insight to say, I got 5 ideas here that came to me. One was in a dream. One is something I read in the newspaper. One I was just driving in traffic. Which one should I go after?
Right. Sometimes you just have a setting or a scene or something. To me, an idea is one where you know there's enough meat on the bones to turn into an episode of television or a movie or whatever. But also, an idea is one. A good idea will evoke an emotional reaction for me when I think about it, and a strong emotional reaction. And that you go, okay, there's probably something there. You don't have to approach it that way. There are times where my partner and I are working on a project and we go, oh, that's an interesting area to explore that hasn't really been done yet. But for me, what I find most interesting is if it gets an emotional reaction out of me.
I think that highlights something we talk about very regularly on the podcast, which is, as a writer, you basically have to be okay with your emotions and in tune with them, right? Whether it's therapy or whether it's being vulnerable, and vulnerable might be the optimal word for this. You have to be aware of your emotions, because your job is to put that emotion into the reader or the viewer.
Yeah, and I worked once with a young writer, and we were talking about something. She goes, "Oh, I can't go there. I won't say. I can't even think about stuff like that." And I was like, you're kind of missing the job. You don't understand what the job of the writer is. Then, I mean, this is your job. Do something else then. Or I guess you could find some kind of work as a writer where you're writing something that's real, I don't know, that doesn't go deep. Maybe it's children's programming or something, but or something silly or light. And there are shows that you can do that, but it's hard to make a career out of doing just that. It's like, that's really hard, to jump from show to show that skips that level. People say to me all the time, like, well, how do you, because I've written some very, the show's a broad spectrum of, like, Wilfred, which was real surreal, and Marin, which is dark and gritty, and then I also did Brickleberry, which is filthy and light, and then, and then King of the Hill. And so the tone is all over the map. And so they're like, well, how do you do that? How do you write for so many different kinds of shows? That's the easy part. It would have been much harder to have a career if I could only do one thing, Then I'd be like, imagine if I only could write like, kind of slapstick, then that'd be fine. I get on a show where it's all slapstick humor, but when that show goes down, then what?
Right. Right. We've used the metaphor of arrows in a quiver before, right? Different skill sets that you develop and you keep them so that you can use them when you need to. And I think refining that, which is kind of the theme of the last couple of podcasts we've done, the last couple of episodes, is you need to build that muscle and strengthen that so that you have the memory to pull it off when you can. Yeah. Whether it's understanding what your first page should be, understanding when to end something, when to stop writing something, when to pursue an idea. And so emotional response for idea, I love that. You mentioned with your personal essays, you keep a list of things that you want to talk about, right? These subjects or things. at your show, you mentioned that those are basically memories that you want to explore, and then you find patterns and kind of weave them together. You go in a really cool process when you talk about that. For what you're doing with your writing partner, do you and Siebert have a list of things that you're writing? Do you have, or do you come up with just sit down and say, we're going to do something new now?
Yeah, we'll just throw out ideas, and the idea has to be one that we're both on board with. So there has to be enough meat on that bone.
There's a litmus test, though, that says, that's worth pursuing.
Yeah. And as far as like the personal essays, because you went, when you saw the show, like the piece is about one thing, but then sometimes as I travel in this piece, I'll take a side trip and I'll explore a different memory, and then I'll come back to it. And it's like, oh, that's kind of where does that take me? But that little memory that I took a side trip for would not have been enough to base a story on. You understand? So that's why I put it into the piece, into a larger piece.
But it some beautiful detail that pays off later. Yeah.
But on its own, it's not enough. And so that's the difference between knowing,
A story, B story, basically. Right?
Well, not really, because it's not like usually a B story, it'll fill the whole episode. You'll keep coming back to it. But as you saw in these pieces that I did, sometimes you just take a side little memory, like jumping in a puddle or whatever when I was a little boy. Like, that's it. It was only about a half a page. And then we just move on. And then I bring it back
at the end because it ties it back to this beautiful core thing, right?
Yeah, that was about me showing that even though I thought I was a man, I was still a little boy. And I intentionally wrote it that way. But that one memory would not have been enough to entertain an audience for any length of time.
Okay, awesome. So when you're sitting down with Siebert and you're coming up with things, are you thinking about current events? Are you thinking about things you've seen in the news? Are you things you found on social media? Like, how does that pitch process go?
The current project that we have set up at Peacock, that idea came to us from the talent, from the producers. So they had this idea and like, hey, can you write this? And we're like, sure. And so it certainly it wasn't our first choice. It wasn't our idea. So it was their idea. They asked if we could write it, and we thought, well, they have enough clout to get this made. Sure, let's do it. And then when you get into it, you feel like it's yours. You take ownership of it. But in the beginning, it's not. It's clearly their idea. The other idea we're working on, we haven't sold yet. We haven't taken it out yet. I can't talk about the details. That was just brainstorming, just coming up with ideas that kind of entertained us. And in this case, I pitched an idea, and he goes, "Oh, that's funny." And then Siebert built on it, and then that it was back and forth. But often it's the other way around. Maybe even more often than not, Siebert will come up with an idea, and he'll say, "What do you think of this?" And then I'll say what I like about it and what I want to explore, and then we'll go down that road. So, yeah, it's just always about narrowing down what's the avenue we're going to go down.
Got it.
We probably do that more often. Yeah.
Cool. For a lot of writers, I think I've seen a lot of writers, so I don't want to speak generally, in generalities too much, but I've seen a lot of writers spend a lot of time working on writing exercises. And I've personally found some of those to be very valuable. We did a whole podcast episode on them. I'll pull up the number and put it in the notes and link back to that. You have one that's specific, is like one specific exercise. And then we talked about like Sundance and some of the things that they do for those exercises. For you, do you find yourself doing any writing exercises or outside of your personal essays? Or did you in your earlier career, mid-career? Or is it just... And let me preface this. You mentioned you have a notebook of writing, this is like rules of writing or lessons about writing. Yeah. Separate from that, is there anything that you've done to just kind of hone your ability to create characters or to kind of come up with ideas or pursue things?
I never did. The only time I did was when I was in a writing class, and the teacher would say, all right, go this weekend, you're going to write a scene about this. And then you give us a setup. And then we come back, and it turns out... And then we'd all write it in, and he was never happy with anything I wrote. And as it turns out, the ideas were all basically premises of Love American Style, which was an old show, I guess, like in maybe early 70s. And so he was basically throwing out ideas that they'd already shot. And you'd say, so, okay, what's your take on this? And then we would write that. We didn't know that at the time. But so that was an exercise because you're only writing one scene. You weren't writing a whole, and that's fine. It's totally okay to write one scene as long as it's as long as it has a good shape to it.
Hey, it's Michael Jamin. If you like my videos and you want me to email them to you for free, join my watch list. Every Friday, I send out my top 3 videos. These are for writers, actors, creative types. You can unsubscribe whenever you want. I'm not going to spam you, and it's absolutely free. Just go to michaeljamin.com/watchlist.
I think about writing exercises, going back to that conversation of like bodybuilding that we had. It's how do I train this muscle? Because this muscle needs to match in size and proportion to this muscle. And that's skill sets. Like I'm training this skill set, which helps me fulfill my craft and my ability. And I think of that macro and then micro. Like what are the macro things I need to do or know how to do? Break a story, write an outline, write a first draft, understand, and then down act breaks. What's a good act break? Mm-hmm. What's a good in? What's a good tag? What's a good, cold open? Deeper. What's a good interaction in the scene? How do I get in and out of this scene? How does this scene relate to this scene? Then plant. How do I plant here? How do I pay that off in the third act? It's just getting tighter and tighter. And we talked about as well in another podcast that Josh Waitzkin, Art of Learning, making small circles bigger. Mm-hmm. So that to me is what writing exercises are. And that is worth its weight in gold at a certain level. But that can also be a distraction from doing the work of writing a pilot. Writing that script, that spec script. You got to do the bigger work still. You can't get caught up in these daily things. And I think a lot of people tend to think I'm a writer because I do writing exercises. And if that's all you want to do, that's fine. But if your goal is to be a professional screenwriter, poet, novelist, you still have to put in the work and execute to get a deliverable.
Yeah. Well, one other thing I could mention is that even when we first start, whether you're writing a pilot or just an episode of a television show, usually the first day or so is you're just, you have an idea that you like, and it's all, stream of conscious. It's like you're brainstorming stuff. You're acting out scenes, and often I'll do this in the writing. I'll just start acting out a scene, and if something sticks, you'll know. And sometimes it doesn't even make it into the show, which is like, that's just too bad. That was a funny scene, but it opened doors. And so often, the very, very first step of writing is not writing at all. It's just talking. It's not even, it's just about really exploring what could be interesting about this and that, and just taking notes and then just finding it. And then another day, you actually might sit down and actually do the work. But a lot of writing, at least in the beginning, is just talking.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've seen that, and I've seen some beautiful stuff come out of those conversations in the writer's room on Tacoma FD that lead to stories, that end up being episodes, and maybe not even this season, but next season we start exploring that specific situation. So
yeah,
really cool process that happens in that world.
Yeah, those guys on Tacoma, they're great at it because Steve and Kevin, the showrunners, they come in on the off season with like one-liners, and often it's like there's just not enough there, but it's enough, not even for a story, but they go, this is a scene. And then the challenge then is to figure out, well, how do we turn that into a story, knowing that they like this one little moment? Can we build to it or can we start from it? But it's great that they bring that in because you go, okay, so that piece is locked into place now. Good. We got something that we can build from.
Would you say that's atypical for most writers in a writing?
I think so. Yeah, I think these guys come in with an agenda, which is great because we hit the ground running because we don't have a lot of time on this show. So the fact that they do that, other shows often the writers are expected to pitch ideas, but in this show they have
blue
ideas.
Sky period, is that what that's called? I've heard it called.
Yeah, or you come in for pitch, and there's always a lot of pressure on it. But since they have ideas that look perfect, I love that. Let's do something that you love. I don't have to get you on board. You already like it. So now my job is to figure out how I can help you make that, which is great.
Yeah. Awesome. In another episode of our podcast, we talked about theme, right? Which is like, what is that emotional thing, or what's the thing we're exploring in this piece? Mm-hmm. Theme versus idea. And I know that you've talked, and you mentioned even earlier, it can be just a setting, it can be a situation, it can be a character, it can be a moment. As far as the difference between theme and idea, do you find one's better for writing?
I often put the theme is often the last thing I put into the work. That's kind of the art. And so when you talk about even the, we shouldn't talk about it too much because no one was there, no, but when you saw the piece that I performed the other week, and so real fast. So that was a piece about how I was dated this girl in college, and I built her up in my mind. And then when finally got to know her, it wasn't, it wasn't as perfect as I made. And it was all my fault because I built her up. It was all my doing. And I likened that to, she had a nervous habit that she wasn't aware of. And I likened that to basically when I was a child, I had jumped into a puddle and I got all wet and I hated it. And I wanted to get dry right away. But my mother's like, you have to wait because we're not home. And then I call it back later. And so kind of like one of the themes of that was really intolerance and the fact that I just couldn't, when I have a problem, I got to get it fixed now. And I still have this problem today. I still have to, as I still have to get things, I got to fix it now because if I don't, I'll forget about it or it won't get done. Yeah. And so that's a theme that I carry through, but that's that's like the last touch I put on it. I wouldn't have possibly thought of, it's more like when you're thinking of wrapping it up, when you're kind of hitting at the end of usually at the end of the piece, you're wrapping it up and you go, okay, what are some threads? What are some that I can tie together in here? What's something I can carry all the way through and tie it up in a bow as if I intended to write it that way? So what are the things that are here? What's the garbage in here that I can pull through and make everyone think I'm a brilliant writer by tying it up, even though that was never my intention? And that's all last draft stuff, not first draft.
That's wonderful. I wonder if I'm spending too much time focusing on theme, though, because I find that theme helps me understand what I'm trying to get across here. Oh. And I'm exploring that theme. And maybe it can go both ways. And I don't want to put a disclaimer on it. It's just an interesting process difference here, right? And
yeah. Sometimes.
Because I think, like, okay, I want to explore belonging, right? Which is like the second feature I wrote. I want to explore belonging and how can I do that? And I know I've got my character and I know I've got this interesting thing that's like a real thing that happened in this place I was in when I was a missionary on the border. But how can I make this about belonging? And then it's like, well, who's my character and what does she want? And where does that come from what's our family like? And I plug that together to string that across. And that's the emotional arcs I'm going throughout that episode to hit that belonging story.
Yeah, you could do that before. Sometimes when I'm working with my partner, we'll battle something we know in advance. And that's because we break the story on the board, so we kind of have an idea. But when I'm writing my own stuff, I don't break it. I just discover it. But for sure, in every episode we write, there's a word that we tend to overuse and might be like belonging. Every character probably says belonging way too much because that's the theme we're carrying through. And we'll often joke, drink, when we drink, it's like a drinking game. You said belonging. Right. And then we'll do another pass where we'll take out that word belonging, we'll substitute it or with another word that's similar to belonging, or we'll just pull it back a little so it's not, so you, the viewer, it's not so obvious that the theme is, but if you think about it, it's there, You don't want to hit people over the head with it.
Yeah, appreciate that. You talk about the difference, it's not the idea, it's the execution, which I think if we ever had a shirt, that would be it. Idea over execution. Let us know if you want merch. We'll make some merch for it.
But so, did you see at the show? I don't know if you were at that show. Someone was like, when are you going to start selling merch?
I wasn't at that show.
I was like, all right. Well, I go, what do you want? Do you want a hat? Do you want a mug? Do you want a pencil? She wasn't clear on what she wanted.
Just literally a writer. Just a Michael Jamin typewriter. You're going to commission your own typewriter. You're going to find the manufacturer. That's funny. But idea versus execution, we talk about that. So we can come up with ideas, and everyone's got an idea, and they all stink, right? And the execution is what makes it good. How do you get better execution? And I think I know the answer, but how do you get better at the execution of the idea?
Well, that's just practice. I mean, it's just over and over. I mean, there's no way around it. There's no, sometimes people say, I get this a lot on social media. Do you have any tips? I'm like, I'm writing a first thing that, my first screenplay. Do you have any tips? I'm like, yeah, study screenwriting. Like tips, you study the craft. There's no tip. There's no hack. There's no, leave your car on overnight. It doesn't work like that. You got to study it. You got to and work at it. That's my tip.
Yeah, I knew that was the answer, right? Is you got to do the work. You got to show up and you got to put in the hours. We call it mat time in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You just got to be on the mats and you got to learn the process. When you first started, I was wondering, what was your first original idea that you wrote? Like,
Yeah, that's the funny thing is when I first started, you wouldn't. They didn't have original ideas. I wrote spec scripts. I wrote sample scripts of existing shows, and I wrote a bunch of them. Everything. I probably wrote a dozen or whatever. I never wrote anything original, a movie or a pilot on my own, ever. I did it with my partner probably 10 years into our career when we first got our first development deal. But and times have changed, unfortunately. Now new writers are expected to write original material, which is so much harder. I feel it's so much harder.
yeah.
So,
But you still learned how to execute an idea. You were just doing it within the world that had been created by
Right.
somebody else.
right, here are the 5 characters you get to play with. Here are the types of stories they tell on this show. Now you get to do your version of it, which
Did you
is
find-
immensely easier.
Easier. But did you find that that process helped you develop that muscle the same way a spec would, like a spec pilot?
It's such a
an
different
original
skill.
pilot.
It's such a different skill set. I don't even know. It's so unfair that they make people young writers or emerging writers do this. It's so unfair. It's yeah. There's so much to learn, and you're saying no, build the world and make it fantastic. It's like, well, first thing they need to learn is how to tell a story. And it's so I feel bad for them. It's so unfair, but this is how it is now.
Yeah, gotcha. And then on the same vein of conversation we're having, I was wondering when you knew that you could execute. At what point in your career were you like, okay, I can do this, and I can do this right?
Well, we wrote a pilot together. Our first pilot that we did together was really well received. I think we wrote it for Paramount. They loved it, and so great. But we were terrified every step of the way. Like you never think you can do it. And then even when I was starting my collection of personal essays, that was on my own. That was without my partner. And even then, I was like, can I do this? And every time I start a new story, and I wrote 21 in that book. Every time I start a new story, can I do this?
Yeah.
Do I know how to do this? It's terrifying. It's like, I don't know, because every story is different. And the funny thing is, and I mentioned this in the show, once it's written, if it's well written, it seems like it was always there. Obviously, this is the story.
Right.
But how could you not know from the beginning? How did you not know? But when I'm writing it, nothing's obvious. When you're staring at that blank page, none of it's obvious. I have no freaking idea how we're going to figure this out. I really don't.
Yeah.
So I just start writing, and then often, and I have to remind myself of this, I don't discover what the story is until halfway through, and then I go back and rewrite the hell out of it. You're talking about draft, 20 at this point. So.
Yeah.
It's such a long process. And then people say, well, you should put on a show once a month. Listen, I'd love to if I could write a story a month that would be worth putting on. It doesn't happen that fast.
Yeah, that's another really important piece of advice you gave me, because I try to go fast on things, and you were just like, give yourself a month to write that spec, or give yourself a month to write that pilot. It doesn't need to be something you spit out. And that's a first draft, right? You're encouraging.
Oh, God. Someone left a comment on social media, and he was like, well, really? I wrote a whole pilot in a half a day. And I'm like, okay, well, all right. So you're either a genius or you're an idiot. And I'm tempted to think you're an idiot because, it's not that easy.
Half a day, man. How do you do that? Kevin Lewandowski, who's in your course, and he's been very open about how much he's appreciated the course. He's a script coordinator now because of it. He jumped from PA to script coordinator because the samples he was writing were good enough that the executive producer, the non-writing executive producer, wanted to help him out. You're like, okay,
Right.
You've got some talent here. But he's like, I timed it, and it's about 40 hours to get through a pilot, just to write a first draft. From the inception to timing, like it's going to take at least 40 hours. And a couple of people at least at my level, that in my sphere, my peers that I'm talking to, it's maybe you could put out a pilot in 2 weeks, but it's not done. It's a draft. It's a first draft.
Yeah, 40 hours sounds real fast, to be honest. That sounds fast to me. Like, because you got to understand, a team of writers working full-time in a writer's room, from idea to let's shoot this episode. I'm not talking about a pilot. I'm talking about an average episode. you're talking about at least 5 or 6 weeks, and people working full time. So
that's to get to a draft, right? Like a draft,
a shooting draft.
Finish. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're talking just bare bones, crap draft. You got it out. Now you can sit down and start rewriting it.
Well, that
this
would be,
guy's talking about one day, like half a day to do that.
I mean, guy, you never know what kind of crazy pills these people are on. You just don't know. I mean,
sure.
But yeah, I mean, it'll take a team of writers working full time at least a week just to break the story on the board, just to figure out what this story is about before a word is written.
So, Michael, awesome. Appreciate the great insights here again. I think revisiting this topic was helpful for me at a different stage, and for many of your original listeners, I think so as well. For your new listeners, I encourage you to go back to episode 10 and listen to that. You're going to hear a lot of the same conversation in that, because the answer is not changing, right? It's execution is important.
Sometimes you got to hear it over and over again before it sinks in. That's how it is for me. So go, don't be frustrated.
But you'll see the nuance. There's a difference in the conversation between the first one and this one. And I think that exploring, these subjects of theme and go back and listen to the whole thing, because we have deeper conversations about each of these topics that we're going through here that kind of build to this moment where we are talking about how do I execute that idea at a higher level. And I think for the people who've been here for a long time, I think I can speak for them and say they're going to get a lot of value out of this episode. And, again, thank you for being open to sharing this information and your experience with everybody. I get so much out of it every time we have these conversations.
Yeah, it's fun. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Subscribe to our watch list, which is our free weekly newsletter at michaeljamin.com/watchlist. You can find me on social media at michaeljaminwriter on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. We got a free lesson if you want to go grab that at michaeljamin.com/free. If you want to find out where I'm touring with a paper orchestra, we got a lot of websites you got to write down here. michaeljamin.com/upcoming. You can find this all on my website, michaeljamin.com. Whatever.
Yeah,
that's the easier way.
Go to the show notes. There are links to everything right there.
And sign up for everything. That's what I recommend. Okay. All right, everyone. Thanks so much. Until next time. Bye-bye.
This has been an episode of Screenwriters Need to Hear This with Michael Jamin and Phil Hudson. If you'd like to support this podcast, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, and sharing this podcast with someone who needs to hear today's subject. For free daily screenwriting tips, follow Michael on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Michael Jamin Writer. You can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Phil A. Hudson. This episode was produced by Phil Hudson and edited by Dallas Crane. Until next time, keep writing.